Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question is, does borderline personality disorder have any subtypes? Now, this is an excellent question, and if we look at the research on borderline personality disorder, there are inconsistent results in terms of the attempts that have been made to answer this question. In the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the DSM, there are no subtypes reported for borderline personality disorder. That doesn't mean subtypes don't exist. It just means that the subtypes haven't been identified with a level of confidence yet to make them official in a publication like the DSM. And even if subtypes are definitively identified at some point, that doesn't necessarily mean that they'll be included in the DSM. Now, if we look at the definition for borderline personality disorder, we see there are 9 symptom criteria, and only 5 are needed to have a diagnosis of borderline personality disorder. This means that 2 individuals who are diagnosed with borderline personality disorder may only share one symptom in common. Potentially, they could only share one symptom in common. This means that the population of individuals who have borderline personality disorder are potentially heterogeneous, meaning there's a lot of variability in terms of what actual symptoms they have. This puts all the more emphasis on trying to find some type of meaningful subtype structure. And a subtype structure that could be used in clinical practice would be the most ideal. So to answer this question in terms of the subtypes in borderline personality disorder, I'm going to be using an article that was published in 2017 by Smits and colleagues. One of the reasons I selected this particular article was because it emphasized the importance of these subtypes being used in clinical practice and the importance of a clinical practitioner being able to use information that was available to them to identify these subtypes. So this paper emphasized taking this theoretical information and applying it to help people who had borderline personality disorder. So 3 subtypes were identified in this study: core borderline personality disorder, extrovert externalizing, and schizotypal paranoid. Now, there were many more people in the core borderline personality disorder than in the extrovert externalizing category, 5 times as many. And in the extrovert externalizing category, there was 10 times as many as there were in the schizotypal paranoid category. So we see unequal group sizes here as far as these subtypes are concerned. When looking at the first potential subtype here, core borderline personality disorder, we see that this particular presentation is really what we think of when we think of borderline personality disorder. This particular presentation was absent a lot of other personality disorder dimensions, and individuals in this group had lower levels of childhood trauma, which was a bit of a surprising finding. It's important to keep in mind, though, that with these participants, trauma was high in general, so there were only lower levels of trauma in this first potential subtype relative to the other subtypes. Now, with the extrovert externalizing subtype, here men were overrepresented in this category. There were more men in this category proportionally than we saw in the other categories. Also, with this category, with this potential subtype, there was a higher quality of life. Now, as I mentioned with the first category, core borderline personality disorder, it was absent a lot of other personality disorder features. The extrovert externalizing category did have personality disorder features, including narcissistic, antisocial, and histrionic. This group had a higher level of childhood trauma relative to the other 2 groups. Now, with the last potential subtype, schizotypal paranoid, there were also personality disorder features, and as is indicated by the name, they were schizotypal and paranoid personality disorder features. The participants in this category also had higher levels of social isolation, higher levels of attachment anxiety, lower levels of self-confidence, and lower levels of assertiveness. So this particular article on subtypes in borderline personality disorder I found to be fairly interesting, and I like the way these subtypes lined up with a lot of the other subtypes we see in the literature. And of course, as I mentioned, the clinical practice aspect. The bottom line with subtypes is they need to be useful in clinical practice. So more studies where we have this type of focus really will help the treatment community. And at some point, we would hope to identify these subtypes repeatedly in a number of studies. So at some point, we may be able to use these subtypes with a little more confidence. At this point, of course, there really isn't much overlap between the research on subtypes in borderline personality disorder and clinical practice. We're moving toward that as a mental health community, but we're not there yet. Borderline personality disorder is often thought of as somewhat difficult to treat, so it really does warrant continued research. I hope you found this description of potential subtypes of borderline personality disorder to be interesting. Thanks for watching.